In 1945, the tide of war in the Pacific was no longer in Japan's favor.
At the beginning of the war, Japan was dominant, but over time they began losing to the advancing American forces. The momentum shifted for the United States after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which led to a major retaliation. This prompted a chilling statement from a Japanese commander, Admiral Yamamoto, who said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant." That giant he was referring to was America. Japan found itself cornered in the Pacific War.
To make things worse, they were now facing the growing force of Russia at their northern borders.
Russian soldiers were eager to avenge the humiliating defeats they had suffered in past decades against Japan. Still, Japan remained steadfast in their Bushido Code, never surrender even in the face of defeat. But one soldier would take this code to the extreme. His name was Hiroo Onoda, the Japanese soldier who refused to surrender for 30 years, long after World War II had ended. Hiroo Onoda was born on March 19, 1922. He joined the Imperial Japanese Army at just 18 years old. Onoda came from a long line of soldiers and warriors. His ancestors were once samurai who fought in numerous feudal battles in Japan.
His father had served as a soldier as well and died in Japan's second major war.
Because of his intelligence and skills, Onoda was trained as an intelligence officer at the elite Nakano School. Nakano was known for producing specialists in jungle warfare and guerrilla tactics.
They trained in sabotage, counterintelligence, and propaganda, skills that Onoda would later use in ways no one could have imagined.
In 1941, Japan invaded the Philippines, displacing the local government and forcing American troops to temporarily retreat.
2 years later, Japanese forces in the South Pacific began to fall apart.
American forces kept growing stronger and pushing Japan back in every encounter. That's when the U.S. planned to take back the Philippines. The Philippines was seen as a strategic stronghold. Whoever controlled it had the upper hand in Southeast Asian trade and oil supply. If the U.S. could push Japan out of the Philippines, they were confident the war would end in just a few months. So in 1944, American forces launched their campaign to retake the country. Japanese troops, overwhelmed by the combined forces of American and Filipino soldiers, had no choice but to retreat. Some fled. Others, like Hiroo Onoda, went into hiding in remote islands. On December 26, 1944, Onoda was sent to Lubang Island and tasked with engaging in guerrilla warfare to resist the incoming U.S. troops. Normally, Japanese troops fought face-to-face with enemies and avoided retreating into jungles, but Onoda was instructed by his commander to do the opposite, to hide in the forest and launch surprise attacks from there. When additional U.S. reinforcements arrived by February 28, 1945, the Japanese forces were finally overrun. Outnumbered and outgunned, they realized they had no way to win. But Onoda and his men were under strict orders: never surrender. If defeat was imminent, they were to die fighting. He instructed his remaining men, Private Akatsu, Corporal Shimada, and Private First Class Kozuka, to retreat with him into the jungle. What they didn't know was that Japan had already surrendered and American troops had withdrawn from the island. Oblivious to these developments, Onoda and his team began launching raids on local Filipino soldiers. By 1945, Onoda noticed the absence of military activity in the area. Cut off from communication, he assumed the war had simply shifted elsewhere and continued his guerrilla campaign. He and his men even ambushed farmers and engaged in shootouts with local police. Eventually, U.S. forces learned that there were still active Japanese soldiers in Lubang Island who were unaware that the war had ended. The U.S. and Philippine military began airdropping leaflets, informing Japanese holdouts that their comrades had surrendered and that the war was over. Onoda eventually found one of these leaflets, but he didn't believe it. He assumed it was enemy propaganda, designed to trick them into surrendering. Because of his propaganda training, he was even more suspicious.
He thought there were still many Japanese soldiers fighting just like him. In his mind, Japan had simply paused its attacks, waiting for the right time to strike back.
By the end of that year, more leaflets were dropped, this time bearing the official surrender orders signed by General Yamashita of the 14th Army. Onoda read them carefully, but again he dismissed them as fake. To him and his men, surrendering was dishonorable, and the idea of Japan giving up was unthinkable. For the next 4 years, Onoda and his group continued living as guerrilla fighters. They raided farms for food, sabotaged fishing boats, and even burned crops. They had learned every inch of the island and used it to survive. They stole fruits, rice, and other supplies, and they were determined to fight to the death. But in 1949, Private Akatsu started to realize the war was probably over. He left the group and lived alone in the jungle for 6 more months before finally surrendering to the Philippine Army in March 1950.
He informed U.S. and Filipino authorities that Onoda and the others were still hiding and believed the war was ongoing. The military then launched an operation to contact their families. Eventually, they secured photos and letters from relatives pleading for the soldiers to come home.
In 1952, these messages were dropped by helicopter all over Lubang Island. When Onoda saw the letters and photographs, he began to suspect that Japan had indeed lost. But he still believed that the letters could have been forged by the enemy. He feared the families were being held hostage and were forced to write false messages to lure them out. This only strengthened Onoda's belief that the war wasn't over. 2 years later, in a search operation, Corporal Shimada was killed by a Filipino search team. Their mission was to locate and arrest the remaining Japanese soldiers for the attacks and killings they had committed over the years. But Onoda, familiar with every corner of the island, evaded capture.
Another 18 years passed.
Onoda and Kozuka continued their attacks, targeting police and farmers. But in 1972, Kozuka was killed during a raid. Now alone, Onoda still refused to surrender. In 1974, a Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki went to the Philippines.
By then, Onoda had become somewhat of a folk legend in Japan. Suzuki wanted to meet the man who never surrendered.
In February of that year, he arrived on Lubang Island and miraculously found Onoda. He greeted him respectfully and said, "Onoda-san, the Emperor and your fellow countrymen are worried about you and your safety." Suzuki explained that the war had ended decades ago, but Onoda refused to believe it.
He said he would only surrender if his commanding officer told him directly. The Japanese government acted immediately and located Major Taniguchi, Onoda's former superior. He was flown to Lubang Island.
On March 9, 1974, the now 52-year-old Onoda emerged from the jungle, still in full uniform, carrying his rifle and sword.
There, he finally received direct orders from Major Taniguchi.
He formally surrendered. Later, Onoda surrendered his sword to the President of the Philippines, who granted him a full pardon for the crimes he had committed during his decades in hiding. When he returned to Japan, Onoda was hailed as a hero.
But he was deeply disappointed to learn the truth.
Japan had surrendered and apologized for the war. The once mighty Japanese military had been defeated. Japan had become a peace-loving liberal society. Onoda felt out of place. He called for Japan to return to its former strength and honor, but no one supported him. Eventually, in 1975, he moved to Brazil to live a quieter life. Hiroo Onoda passed away on January 16, 2014.